Welcome back. My name is Brenda Davis.
The learning objectives for part 2 are: describe at least 3 negative health consequences of diets rich in refined carbohydrate. State the optimal intake of fiber for people with type 2 diabetes and the relative amounts of specific foods that would be needed to achieve these intakes. Describe at least 3 advantages to obtaining protein from plant sources rather than animal sources. Provide at least 5 recommendations for reducing the glycemic load of the diet, and list the primary plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids and the quantity of alpha-linolenic acid provided per serving.
This particular segment will include steps 2 through 6 of reversing diabetes. So I hope you enjoy it. We're going to be talking a lot about carbohydrates and fiber and fat and glycemic index. And so I think you'll get a lot out of this particular segment. So step 2 is to minimize refined carbohydrate, starches, and sugars.
Contrary to popular opinion, carbohydrates are not the problem. In fact, carbohydrates from whole foods are highly protective and consistently associated with reduced morbidity and mortality. If you look around the world, you will see many populations with high carbohydrate intakes that are extraordinarily healthy. And of course, the people of the blue zones are a perfect example. They average over 60% of their calories from carbohydrates.
If we look at the average percent of calories from carbohydrates in common foods, what we see is whole plant foods contain between about 92%, which is upwards, fruit and starchy vegetables are around the 90%, grains and legumes in the 70s, and then non-starchy vegetables are pretty close to 60% of calories from carbohydrates. Nuts and seeds are the only category of plant foods that are low in carbohydrates at about 12%. So when you think about these diets that are 5 or 10 or 20% carbohydrates, you look at the percentages of calories from carbohydrates from whole plant foods, you can see something very quickly. You don't have a lot of room for whole plant foods in very low carbohydrate diets because the number one source of calories in those foods is carbohydrates. So I think it's important to understand that. So the carbohydrate naysayers consistently forget that the foods most strongly associated with disease risk reduction, whole plant foods, get most of their calories from carbohydrates, with the exception of nuts and seeds. Refined carbohydrates are where the problem lies. So diets that are rich in refined carbohydrates, particularly added sugars, increase our risk for overeating and obesity, fatty liver, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome and diabetes, dyslipidemia, and cardiovascular disease. It's so important when you think about the low-carb diets. They have a point about saying that carbohydrates are unhealthy because, unfortunately, most of the carbohydrates people eat are coming from these sources. So what are we talking about when we talk about refined carbohydrates? Well, we're talking about really 2 categories of foods. We're talking about simple refined carbohydrates like sugars, so regular sugar, syrups, jams, jellies, candies, sweetened beverages like sodas. And we're talking about complex refined carbohydrates like white flour products, white rice products, concentrated starches. These are essentially high carbohydrate foods that have been stripped of their nutrients by food processing techniques. And therein lies the problem. I want to just discuss a little bit about what happens when we refine grains. So when we refine a whole grain, whether it's wheat or kamut or whatever it is, we actually lose the parts of the grain that we know are super protective to health. So for example, taking a whole wheat berry and turning it into white flour, we're removing the bran, which is the fiber-rich outer layer of the grain, and we're removing the germ, which is the nutrient-dense core, which has a lot of the protein and the B vitamins and the phytochemicals and all of those things. We remove the germ because it also contains the fat. And the fat is, of course, where the vitamin E is and such. And the fat, of course, can become rancid. So if you just grind it up whole, it will be less shelf stable. So when we make a white grain, it's much more shelf stable. But in the process of turning a whole grain into a white grain, we lose about 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals, and about 95% of the phytochemicals. So this is not good news if we're trying to reverse disease. And the bottom line again is nobody eats a bowl of white flour. Before we eat the flour, we add the cheapest fat we can, especially if it's a processed food. It's cheap fat, cheap sugar, salt, and a bunch of additives and preservatives. And then we eat the white flour, and therein lies the problem. Not only have we removed everything of value, or most of what is of real value to human health, we've added a bunch of things that we know are damaging to human health. And so we've removed many of the nutrients that we need to actually metabolize carbohydrates, like the B vitamins. We're loading up on these things that are nutritionally depleted, but are loaded with, things that are really very harmful to human health. So that you need to understand as well. Unfortunately, most of the carbohydrates people eat are refined. Probably in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of the carbohydrates people eat in North America are refined. And that is a huge problem where diabetes is concerned. And this is not an easy thing for people to change, because a lot of these foods are comfort foods. Breads and pasta, macaroni and cheese and cookies and boxed cereals and pretzels and crackers and cupcakes and whatever. These are comfort foods for people. So removing them is not easy, but it's non-negotiable. If you want to succeed in reversing diabetes, these foods have to go. It's non-negotiable.
What is a safe level of added sugars? According to the World Health Organization and the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines for Americans, added sugars should amount to less than 10% of total calories, or 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. The World Health Organization suggests less than 5% of calories for additional health benefits, or no more than 6 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. The American Heart Association suggests an upper limit of 9 teaspoons per day for men and 6 teaspoons per day for women. What about for those treating type 2 diabetes? Optimal intakes are 0 or as close to 0 as possible. Average intakes in the United States are upwards of 17 teaspoons a day. When reading labels, it's helpful to know that 1 teaspoon of sugar is about 4 grams.
So one thing that we can do is to start to read labels and recognize at 4 grams of sugar. So if a label says 16 grams of sugar, there's 4 teaspoons there. And the one thing that a lot of people don't realize.
What is a safe level of added sugars? According to the World Health Organization, calories, or 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. The World Health.
So one thing that we can do is to start to read labels and recognize at 4 grams of sugar. So if a label says 16 grams of sugar, there's 4 teaspoons there. And the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that 1 serving of a fairly sweet food can have more than 12 grams of sugar in it. So a 12-ounce soda is very close to 12 teaspoons of sugar. A large flavored coffee can have up to 18. Even a cup of fruit yogurt can have 9 to 12. A cinnamon bun, 12. And so you're above that 10% just with 1 serving of a single food. And then if we look at foods that you don't really think of as being sweet, like an energy bar or barbecued sauce or even tomato sauce, a flavored instant oatmeal, they can have 3 to 6 teaspoons of sugar quite easily. And so you can see how easy it is for the numbers to add up. It doesn't take much. And even salad dressings can have 2-3 teaspoons of sugar. Non-fat salad dressings are mostly sugar. That's where they get their flavor from. Ketchup and all of those are, 50% of calories from sugar. So we need to learn to read labels.
If you look at the sources of sugar in the American diet as a percent of total calories, an estimated 47% comes in the form of sweet beverages such as soda. This is pretty shocking. If people did nothing more than stop drinking sugar, they could cut their sugar intake almost in half. The other major contributors are sweets and snacks, and grains and mixed dishes with added sugars. You might be curious why fruits and vegetables are listed here. This is because some fruits and vegetables are processed with added sugars. For example, jams and jellies, fruit canned with syrup, condiments like barbecue sauce, ketchup, and relish, all of which, of course, have significant amounts of added sugars.
So what about the sugar in fruit? Here we are talking about sugar and all things sweet. Is the sugar in fruit in the same category as other sugar? And the answer is absolutely, positively not. Whole fruits are consistently shown to be protective to health. Why? Because fruits contain fiber. The sugar is packaged with fiber. Fiber slows the absorption of sugar and helps to increase satiety. Fruits are loaded with antioxidants, which help to reduce oxidative stress, with phytochemicals, which have all sorts of disease-fighting actions, with vitamins and minerals, especially potassium, vitamin C, and folate. So you're getting a lot with the sugar that's there. But the other thing to know is the sugar is less concentrated in fruit than it tends to be in processed foods and liquid sugar beverages. So it's a whole different ballgame. We want to include fruits in the diet. But we need to recognize that the body is very well equipped to process the amount of fructose that's naturally present in fruit. When we extract fructose and we add it to beverages and processed foods, the body's ability or capacity to handle the fructose becomes very quickly overwhelmed. And the daily American fructose intakes average about 37% of total sugars and 9% of daily calories. And I've seen even higher estimates. So it's a fair chunk of what we're consuming. And I wanted to talk about a study that I just read not long ago in Cell Metabolism. And this particular study really did something interesting because we didn't really fully understand the metabolic fate of fructose prior to this particular study coming out. For many years, scientists and nutritionists and physicians believed that fructose was metabolized almost exclusively by the liver. And as soon as you ate fructose, it would be shuttled by the bloodstream very quickly to the liver, and the liver would convert it to glucose or to fatty acids to be stored as fat or whatever. So it was either fatty acids or sugar. But this evidence from this new study suggests that most of the fructose we consume is actually converted to glucose and other metabolites in the intestinal tract. So we actually have enzymes that convert it right there. And if, in fact, we didn't convert it into the enzymes, the liver would be absolutely overwhelmed. And even as it is, the liver gets very quickly overwhelmed if we're drinking liquid fructose. So if fructose intake is really high, intestinal conversion just can't keep up, and the excess gets shuttled to the liver for processing, or it passes into the colon where it feeds harmful bacteria. So we want to be very careful that the fructose we're eating always comes packaged with fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants, as it is in fruit. So let's take a look. So here's the fructose in fruit. And just for comparison purposes, a 20-ounce bottle of Pepsi has about 36 grams of fructose. The average fruit has about 6. So you'd have to eat 6 fruits to get the same amount of fructose as you would get in one Pepsi. You're not going to eat 6 fruits in the amount of time you drink a 20-ounce bottle of Pepsi, which can be seconds for some people. The fruit would be distributed throughout the day, giving your body time to deal with it. The absorption is slowed because of the fiber in the fruit. And so you can see the fruits at the top of the list with the most fructose are apples and grapes, and at the lower end, things like kiwi, apricots, strawberries, and then somewhere in the middle, we've got watermelon, peaches, oranges, bananas. And the bananas, though, this would change depending on the ripeness. As the banana becomes super ripe, the fructose might go up. And if it's quite green, it would go down. So what's the problem with added fructose? Well, the thing that we need to understand about fructose is all of the bad things about glucose are magnified with fructose. It's just very similar consequences, but more pronounced. So with fructose, we get a more rapid buildup of fat in the liver, contributing to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. With fructose, we get more visceral fat and inflammation than we get with glucose. With fructose, we get a much more rapid production of uric acid and an increased risk of gout compared to glucose. Again, with fructose, we get more rapid insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes. And also fructose is a more potent increaser of triglycerides and risk for atherosclerosis. So we really want to be cautious of consuming a lot of foods with added fructose. Really, we want none. That's the goal. We want fructose from fruits, not from processed foods. So just summing up our information on carbohydrates, we want to be getting our carbohydrates from vegetables, fruits, legumes, and whole grains. We want to avoid added sugars, especially sugars in beverages. And we want to minimize all refined carbohydrates, whether they're sugars or starches. They all need to go. Step 3 is to boost fiber. So fiber is highly protective. Studies have shown a very positive association between a high dietary fiber intake. And by high dietary fiber, the researchers were looking at people who were consuming at least 25 grams a day for fiber in women and at least 38 in men. And the high fiber diet was associated with a 20 to 30% risk reduction for type 2 diabetes. And what we know is that insoluble, non-viscous, and usually non-fermentable fiber coming primarily from cereal grains, it has the strongest association for reducing type 2 diabetes risk. Whereas soluble, viscous, fermentable types of fibers tend to slow gastric emptying and improve postprandial glycemic response. So they tend to be even more protective for people who already have diabetes. But you can see that both types of fibers are valuable. So let's talk about the sources of fiber. So we have insoluble, non-viscous, non-fermentable fiber generally in wheat and other grains, lentils and beans, corn, mushrooms, pumpkin, apples, bananas, berries, dates, pears, nuts, and seeds. And then the soluble fiber, and you'll notice some of these foods are in both categories because they're rich in both insoluble and soluble fiber. So the soluble or viscous fiber is the type of fiber that if you combine it with water, it gets really gluey. And that's the viscosity and the solubility of the fiber. And so you'll see, for example, if you mix flax seeds with water, you could almost just stir the ground flaxseed in water, let it sit, and eventually it gets so gluey, almost stringy. And oats do the very same thing. So you see this type of fiber in beans, barley, oats, flax seeds, avocados, citrus fruits, figs, passion fruits, plums, beets, Brussels sprouts, dark greens, kohlrabi, parsnips, peas, rutabaga, sweet potatoes. And this is one of the reasons you want such variety in your diet, because the greater the variety of fiber you'll be eating as well. So how much fiber? Well, as we mentioned, the recommended intakes are 38 grams for men, 25 for women. And that's for people in the 19 to 50-year-old category. It goes down to 30 grams for men over 51 in 21 to women over 51. And that's simply because of reduced caloric intake. So we're looking usually at about 14 grams per 1,000 calories of food intake. That having been said, the maximum health benefits are achieved with intakes of at least 20 grams per 1,000 calories, or 40 grams in a 2,000 calorie diet. More is better. And this is the real shocker. Estimated intakes in Paleolithic times from 2 different studies were about 70 to 150 plus grams of fiber per day. Just unbelievable. So people eating the most meat, so the hunters, the far northern hunters, were still getting 70 grams of fiber a day. The people living closer to the equator were getting 150 to upwards of 200 grams of fiber a day. And this comes as quite a shock to people because they would have never imagined that amount. And where do we get fiber? Plants. Now, wild plants have probably triple the fiber of commercial plants that have been bred to be more palatable. But nonetheless, they were still eating a lot of plants. And intakes of 70, 80 grams a day may really be more close to ideal intakes. So how much do we get from food? Well, the most concentrated fiber foods are beans, 10 to 20 grams a day, and many are 18, 19 grams a day per cup. Avocados are a surprising source of fiber. 1 200-gram fruit, which is a fairly good size avocado, 13.5 grams. Most grains, a cup of cooked grains is about 5 to 10. Most berries are around 3 to 8, and then all other fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds are somewhere 2 to 5 per serving, so per cup of fruits or vegetables or per quarter cup of nuts and seeds. And so this, I think, is important to know and to understand that people who remove grains completely have to work at getting enough fiber a little harder unless they're eating a lot of beans. Only plant foods contain fiber, and what you know is a lot of these low-carb diets, but especially paleo diets, remove both grains and beans. And so where's the fiber coming from? Fruits and vegetables. So of course the total fiber comes nowhere close to the 70 to 150 grams that people consumed in Paleolithic times. So what do we want to aim for? At least 12 to 15 grams of fiber per meal from a variety of sources, preferably 20 grams of fiber per meal. And just to be aware, we get very little fiber from refined. So what do we want to aim for? At least 12 to 15 grams of fiber per meal from a variety of sources, preferably 20 grams of fiber per meal. And just to be aware, we get very little fiber from refined carbohydrates like white flour products, from fast foods, from highly processed foods. And we get absolutely zero fiber from meat, poultry, fish, and eggs. We get no fiber from dairy products, and we get no fiber from fat, oil, or sugar. So if the diet is rich in those components, the diet is also low in fiber. You know, and I have to tell you here, when I worked in the Marshall Islands, one of the things that really shocked me was people were eating an average of 5 to 10 grams of fiber a day, and they had bowel movements probably on average once or twice a week. And it was just the diet was so low in fiber. When we put them on a whole food plant-based diet as part of our lifestyle intervention, their fiber went from 5 or 10 grams a day to 50 grams a day. And it actually scared them. They had questions about whether or not it was safe to be going to the bathroom every day. They weren't used to that. So it was quite an interesting experience. And I have to say, just to give you an idea, I'm not talking about the Marshall Islands much here, but I really want to tell you what they're living on. So they eat meat and white sticky rice, mainly, a lot of Spam. They drink luau, which is high fructose corn syrup. And the children, their favorite snack is ramen noodles with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top. So I couldn't design a diet to induce diabetes more effectively than the diet that has been adopted. And that's why they have among the highest rates of diabetes on the planet. So it was really interesting to see how rapidly they improved when they started eating a very high fiber plant-based diet. It was just incredible. So moving on to step 4, we want to aim for a low glycemic load. And that means focusing on foods that don't cause a rapid rise in blood sugar. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about the definitions or the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load. Glycemic index is a measure of how food affects blood sugar. And glycemic load factors in the actual amount of carbohydrate you're eating. So it's the amount of carbohydrate in a food times the glycemic index. And foods that are rapidly digested and absorbed have a high glycemic index. Foods with a high glycemic index trigger a greater insulin response. And so the glycemic index is actually based on consuming exactly 50 grams of carbohydrate from a food. Blood glucose response is compared to a control food, and that control food's usually glucose. So you'd have 50 grams, you would take a look at blood sugar curve after consuming 50 grams of glucose, and then compare that curve to what the curve would look like after eating 50 grams of carbohydrate from a variety of foods. Then you would have several individuals doing that to come up with a glycemic index. The glycemic load is the actual amount of carbohydrate provided by a typical serving of the food, as we rarely consume exactly 50 grams of carbohydrate from a food. So the glycemic load is quite a typical indicator of how the food will affect blood sugar.
Not all high glycemic index foods are forbidden. Some foods with a high glycemic index have a low glycemic load. These foods may be viewed as harmful by some people when they're actually quite healthful. Generally, these foods have a small impact on blood glucose when they're consumed in moderate amounts. Two great examples are watermelon and carrots, both of which are healthy foods, even for people with type 2 diabetes. Watermelon has a glycemic index of 72, but its glycemic load is only 4. A low glycemic load is anything up to 10. A medium glycemic load is 11 to 19, and a high glycemic load is 20 or more. The glycemic load is calculated by multiplying the glycemic index by the amount of carbohydrate in one serving of the food, and then dividing by 100. So for watermelon, we multiply 72 by 6 grams of carbohydrate, the amount that we would find in a typical serving, and then divide by 100. The numbers are not much different for carrots, which have a glycemic index of 71. With 9 grams of carbohydrate per serving, the glycemic load is 6.4 or low. So while it's best not to eat an entire watermelon or drink 20 ounces of carrot juice, it is absolutely fine to include a serving of watermelon or carrots as part of a healthy plant-based diet mix.
So the most appropriate uses for glycemic index and glycemic load are, first of all, they are very valuable tools, but they have a lot of limitations. They're best used to compare similar foods or foods in the same category. So you could compare millet versus barley, or rice versus barley, or rice milk versus soy milk, or an apple versus an orange. Similar foods in the category, and then it will help you to select the foods that might be most protective in terms of evening out your blood glucose levels. So the cautions where glycemic index and glycemic load are concerned. Number one, you should never use glycemic index and glycemic load as the sole determinant of the nutritional quality of a food. Why? Because they don't tell us about a food's protective factors, nor do they tell us about a food's harmful factors. For example, foods that are low in carbohydrates have a low glycemic index and glycemic load, regardless of how harmful they are. Deep-fried pork rinds have a low glycemic index. Processed meat like bacon has a low glycemic index. It doesn't make them healthy foods. High-fat foods like deep-fried potatoes have a lower glycemic index than a baked potato. It doesn't make them a better choice than a baked potato. Glycemic index does not take into account food combinations that can blunt impact. So we might think a potato is a really bad food, but when you eat it with black bean sauce and kale, it may be just a fine food because it blunts the glycemic index. When you look at glycemic load and type 2 diabetes risk, it's quite interesting to see how. When you look at glycemic load and type 2 diabetes risk, it's quite interesting to see how profoundly the glycemic load can affect risk. We have 24 prospective cohort studies that show consistent, strong relationship between glycemic load and type 2 diabetes. The relative risk of type 2 diabetes was 45% higher for every 100-gram increment of glycemic load. And a 100-gram increment of glycemic load basically equals 100 grams of carbohydrates with a glycemic index of 100, which would be something like a very, very high GI rice. 200 grams of a carbohydrate with a glycemic index of 50, something like oatmeal. 300 grams of a carbohydrate with a glycemic index of 33, something like beans. So you get the idea you can eat more carbohydrates and get the same result as what you would get from something had a higher GI and a smaller amount of carbohydrates. So it's quite interesting to look at this. So I want to talk a little bit about glycemic index and glycemic load as it pertains specifically to people with type 2 diabetes. Clinical research shows that replacing high GI foods with low GI foods improves glycemic control and postprandial glycemia, and it also reduces high sensitivity CRP or inflammation. High GL diets also increase risk of cardiovascular disease in people with diabetes. So what is the glycemic index of selected foods? There are some wonderful glycemic index tools online, and I know there's a site called, I think, David Mendoza that has extensive GI lists. So GI lists are fairly easy to find online if you don't want to go right to the research. But basically what we've got here is just a select few foods. I've got several slides of this, but just to show you, the foods in green have a low GI and a low GL, in yellow medium and red high. And you'll notice that not all foods with a high GI also have a high GL. So going down the list, Calrose white rice has a high GI and GL. Cornflakes, high both. Potatoes, high both. White bread and whole wheat bread actually have a high GI, but a low GL because a serving is an ounce or one slice of bread. If you had more, heavier, you would increase, or let's say you had 2 slices of bread, you would double the GL, and then the white bread would be in the red zone. Not quite the brown bread, it would be 18, so it would be in the yellow zone. White table sugar has a GI of 68. This is so confusing to people. They go, how can white rice have a higher GL than white sugar? And it's really very simple. The glycemic index is really based on types of sugars in foods and types of carbohydrates. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's really a matter of fructose content. And then you'll see below all of these foods with a low GI, from oatmeal to heavy whole grain bread to bananas and white spaghetti, whole wheat spaghetti, beans, barley, peanuts. But if you look on the other side at the glycemic load, so how it actually affects your blood sugar, a serving of those foods, you can see that oatmeal is sort of in the middle. So is a banana, so is whole wheat spaghetti, so is barley. Whereas the heavy bread, just 1 ounce, is low. Beans are extremely low, and peanuts are almost not even on the chart at 1.
If we look specifically at fruit, you can see that watermelon has a very high glycemic index, while apricots, cantaloupe, cherries, and pineapple have a medium glycemic index. However, everything but bananas have a low glycemic load. On the other hand, if you look at the last column or the right-hand column, you can see that the sugar content varies considerably, with cherries, grapes, and mango topping the chart with 15 or more grams per serving, while strawberries and watermelon have only 6 to 7 grams per serving. So what I'm saying here is all fruits are not equal and don't have an equal impact on blood glucose levels. The bottom line here is that fruits are a very valuable part of the diet for people with type 2 diabetes. But in some cases, people do need to moderate their intakes of specific types of fruits.
And so then within the sort of processed food world, we don't want to be eating processed food. We want to stick to whole plant foods as much as possible. But if we look at some processed foods, you can see differences in the low GI, medium GI, high GI for each category. If you look at breads, heavy pumpernickel bread or really, really heavy bread, it's going to have a much lower GI and a low GI generally. Medium would be like a heavy whole wheat bread, a heavy rye bread, a whole wheat pita bread, which doesn't have the light, fluffy texture of a leavened bread, would be in the medium category. Then in the high category would be a lighter whole wheat bread, fluffier breads, whether they're whole wheat or white, would be high GI bread. And the ready-to-eat cereals, you can see the same. The heaviest cereals like all bran or bran cereals or unsweetened muesli, which is super heavy cereal, would be low. The flaked cereals or wheat biscuits like shredded wheat in the middle. And then the light puffy cereals like Rice Krispies and puffed wheat and corn pops and all of those kinds of cereals would be in the high zone. And then for whole grains, even with whole grains, we see big differences. Barley, buckwheat, oat groats, quinoa, wheat, spelt, kamut would all be quite low, whereas basmati rice, couscous, millet, high amylose rice, most brown rice would be in the middle. And sometimes millet is actually in the high because there's some GI estimates at about 71 for millet, others just in the high 60s. So anyway, jasmine rice, sticky rice, low amylose rice would be in the high. And so anyway, you get the idea. We'll move on from here. So what things affect GI? Well, there are a number of things. Number one, the type of monosaccharide present. So you remember when we showed sugar having a much lower GI than some sticky white rice. That's because of the type of monosaccharide present. So in the rice, it's mostly glucose. And in the sugar, it's half glucose, half fructose. And fructose has a super low GI. The type of starch present, so amylose versus amylopectin. So amylopectin is a more branched starch, and it gets broken down more quickly than does amylose, which is a very straight starch. The amount and type of fiber present, so soluble fiber, viscous fiber, will slow absorption more than non-viscous fiber. And of course, high fiber foods have much greater impact on reducing glycemic index than foods that are low in fiber. The physical barrier around the food can even affect the food. So if it's a really hard skin or fairly hard shell, like in hemp seeds that have that hard shell on them still. Exposure to heat. So more we heat foods, the more we break things down, making them more absorbable. The particle size. So as you decrease particle size, you increase surface area and you increase the rate at which the food will be absorbed into the bloodstream. The density of a food. Do you remember seeing on the charts white bread having a glycemic index of about 75 and white pasta in the 40s somewhere, whether it was 44 or 48, I can't remember. But anyway, they're both made with white flour, so why would they be different? Well, they're different because the pasta is a dense white grain, whereas the bread is light, fluffy, so it gets broken down more quickly. And then the crystallinity of the food. This is so interesting. If you cook a potato and then you take that potato and you put it in the refrigerator, it changes the crystallization of the starches in the food and it makes it much harder to break down. So a potato salad will have a much lower GI than boiled potatoes, for example. Even without the mayonnaise, if you just add, vinegar or whatever, it doesn't matter. But just the potato, even just cold potatoes, if you take a cold potato and slice it onto a salad, much lower GI than the hot potato that hasn't been refrigerated. And then the other thing that affects GI is acidity. So more acid on foods, if you put something like balsamic vinegar or lemon or lime juice, it will reduce the glycemic impact of that food. So how do we reduce the glycemic load of the food? Well, simply by emphasizing non-starchy vegetables and legumes, which tend not to have as big of a glycemic load as grains and starchy vegetables. So if we really make those big features of the meal, so for example, you could do a stew with lots of beans, different kinds of beans, and lots of different kinds of vegetables, including some slightly starchy vegetables like maybe butternut squash or turnips, but mostly non-starchy vegetables. We've got carrots and green beans and cabbage, and that makes for a very low GL meal compared to if you added a lot of potatoes or grains into the meal. Then we want to control serving sizes of starchy vegetables and grains to reduce the glycemic load. And this is, like I mentioned in the Marshall Islands, the reason that we had such trouble with their blood sugars after meals is when they took a serving of rice, it was 2 cups, it was 3 cups. That's why we had to start measuring it out, because that amount of starch will cause a great rise in glycemic load. And then we want to select lower GI starchy vegetables and whole grains. So you could do sweet potatoes instead of white potatoes, intact rather than ground grains, or even barley instead of millet. So those are ways of reducing the glycemic load. And then what we need to understand, and this may be one of the most important slides of the whole presentation. All whole grains are not created equal, or really the next slide is the one that I would say is most important, but all whole grains are not created equal. A granola bar does not equal a bowl of oatmeal, and a box of Kamut flakes does not equal a bowl of Kamut berry salad. And this is a mistake that people with diabetes and other people make all the time. They think that I'm eating whole grain bread, I'm eating puffed wheat, but it's a whole wheat that's been puffed. I'm eating rice cakes, but they're brown rice cakes, and so it's all good. It's not quite all as good as what you may think it is. So there is a hierarchy where whole grains are concerned. And at the top of the hierarchy are the intact whole grains, like Kamut berries, quinoa, barley, brown rice. If you sprout those intact whole grains, they're even better because you've reduced anti-nutrients, you've liberated stored nutrients, you've multiplied the phytochemicals. You do a lot of good when you sprout a food. Next on the list would be cut whole grains like steel cut oats. All you've done is cut them. So you've exposed the contents to air, so there's going to be some loss of nutrients by doing that, but not much. Then next on the list would be rolled whole grains. So you're actually exposing more of the grain and you're increasing the surface area a little more. So still a pretty good grain, but definitely not quite where a cut or an intact grain would be. Next on the list would be a shredded whole grain like shredded wheat. And again, not a terrible grain, but certainly more processed than the grains above it. Then we would have the ground whole grains like whole wheat and whole wheat flour products. So whole wheat bread, whole wheat pasta, whole wheat whatever you can think of, whole wheat crackers. And then the next would be the flaked whole grain like a whole grain cereal. And then at the bottom of the whole grain hierarchy would be puffed whole grains like puffed wheat, puffed rice, puffed millet. Now, what you need to be very clear of with this hierarchy is refined grains are not a part of this hierarchy. We're just focused on whole grains. All whole grains are not created equal. And the reason is, as you go down the hierarchy, you increase the glycemic index of the whole grain. You're making it lighter and fluffier. You're increasing the surface area. So you're increasing the rate at which it will be absorbed. And you're destroying nutrients. When you puff a grain, you put it under 1,500 pounds of pressure to puff it, you're destroying nutrients. So that's what we need to realize. And so where diabetes is concerned, I would say draw a line at rolled whole grains. If you want to have even greater impact, you can draw the line at intact whole grains. When you stick to only intact whole grains, you automatically cut out breads, boxed cereals, all of these crackers and cookies and pretzels and all of these foods that are problematic for people with diabetes. And then even with the intact whole grains, you want to moderate somewhat the portion size. So the other thing you can do is include foods known to reduce the glycemic impact of meals. So legumes, because of the soluble fiber, they help to reduce the glycemic response. Healthy fats, like in nuts and seeds and avocados, can help to reduce the glycemic response. Acid from lemon or lime. So the other thing you can do is include foods known to reduce the glycemic impact of meals. So legumes, because of the soluble fiber, they help to reduce the glycemic response. Healthy fats, like in nuts and seeds and avocados, can help to reduce the glycemic response. Acid from lemon or lime juice, from vinegars, can significantly reduce the glycemic response. and cinnamon to some extent can also reduce the glycemic response. Step 5 is replace animal with plant protein. This comes as a shock to people because many people are led to believe that for diabetes, the best diets you can consume are low carbohydrate, higher fat diets that have a lot of meat in them. So when you tell people to replace animal protein, chicken, fish, beef, pork, with plant protein, they're stunned because plant protein foods contain carbohydrates. Animal protein foods, with the exception of dairy, don't. Protein type and risk of type 2 diabetes. We actually have a study of over 200,000 participants, and this was Nurses' Health Study, Health Professionals Follow-Up Study from Harvard. The intake of animal protein was associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, while higher intake of vegetable protein was associated with a lower risk. And that risk was actually quantified by replacing 5% of energy from animal protein with plant protein, resulted in a 23% reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. So imagine if you replace 10%, that would be a 46% reduction. This is really quite powerful. And then we have the Melbourne Collaborative Cohort Study and meta-analysis. They actually looked at their own cohort and then talked about a meta-analysis they did as well. But in their own cohort of over 21,000 participants, in women, there was a 40% risk reduction in type 2 diabetes in people consuming the highest versus the lowest quintile of plant protein, whereas those consuming the highest versus the lowest quintile of animal protein had a 29% higher risk in type 2 diabetes. And then in their meta-analysis, the results weren't quite as powerful, but still fairly powerful. Over 500,000 participants, those in the highest versus lowest quintile of plant protein intake had a 5% lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and those in the highest versus lowest quintile of animal protein intake had a 19% higher risk of type 2 diabetes.
Another study of protein intake included over 6,000 participants age 50 plus from NHANES 3, and they were followed for 18 years. In this trial, those consuming over 20% of calories from protein dramatically increased the risk of type 2 diabetes. Those ages 50 to 65 years increased risk by almost 4 times, and those over the age of 65 increased risk by over 10 times. 20% of calories from protein is not all that unusual for people with diabetes, as they tend to try to reduce carbohydrate intake. So of course, protein intake naturally rises. And in paleo diets, the target is actually 30% of calories from protein. So in a 2,000 calorie paleo diet, this would mean a person would be consuming about 150 grams of protein per day. The RDA for men is about 56 grams a day on average. One interesting note with this study is that the associations of protein to type 2 diabetes were either completely abolished or greatly attenuated when the protein came from plants.
And then we have another 2018 study from the Netherlands called the Rotterdam study. And in this study, almost 7,000 participants, after adjusting for socio-demographic and lifestyle factors, plant-based diets were associated with lower insulin resistance, an 11% lower prediabetes risk, and an 18% lower type 2 diabetes risk. And if we look at meta-analyses that have analyzed and then we have another 2018 study from the Netherlands called the Rotterdam. And if we look at meta-analyses that have analyzed the relationship between red meat intake and diabetes risk, we've got 6 studies here that are between 2012 and 2015 that again so consistently show increased risk of diabetes with meat intake. And you can see the worst is with the processed red meat. 2 studies, 51% increased risk, and 1 study, 32%. One study was smaller, 12%, but generally a very significant increased risk with the intake of processed red meat. This is probably not the very best way of looking at this because some of the studies looked at per serving and some of the studies were quartile or quintile. So this is just sort of the findings of the study. Total red meat between 26 and 48% increased risk. And then poultry, there was one study that looked at poultry and found a 20% increased risk. And then total meat between 8 and 36% increased risk in 3 of the studies. So very consistent positive association between meat intake and diabetes risk.
If we look at the difference between legumes and meat or poultry, the why becomes very obvious. Legumes are the highest fiber foods in the diet. Meat and poultry have no fiber. Legumes are high in phytochemicals. Meat and poultry have no phytochemicals. Legumes are high in antioxidants. Levels are minimal in meat and poultry. Legumes are low in fat and saturated fat. Meat is high in fat and saturated fat. Poultry is slightly lower than red meat, but still very significantly higher than legumes. Legumes are cholesterol-free. Meat and poultry are relatively high in cholesterol. Legumes contain non-heme iron, which does not promote oxidative stress. About 40% of the iron in meat and poultry is in the heme form, which can act as a pro-oxidant. Legumes are free of added hormones and antibiotics. Meat and poultry can contain both added and natural hormones and added antibiotics. Legumes are free of the pro-inflammatory molecule Nu-5GC. Meat is the source of Nu-5GC. You cannot produce TMAO by eating legumes. You certainly do when you consume meat. Legumes tend to be low in chemical contaminants. Meat and poultry concentrate the chemical contaminants that move up the food chain. Legumes are not a significant source of endotoxins. Meat can be quite high in endotoxins, especially ground meat like hamburger. So what is Nu-5GC? Well, Nu-5GC, or N-glycolylneuramic acid, is a pro-inflammatory sialic acid that's found only in animal flesh foods. Humans don't actually make Nu-5GC, but it is incorporated into human tissues when we consume it. Evidence suggests that Nu-5GC contributes to systemic inflammation and the progression of cancer.
What is TMAO? TMAO is an atherogenic compound formed from conversion of carnitine or choline by very specific gut microbes. People who consume plant-based diets have either none or remarkably fewer of the bacteria that have the capacity to form TMAO. So this is really interesting. As a matter of fact, there are studies done where we have a vegan eat a steak or give them carnitine supplements, and they don't produce any TMA at all, or TMAO for that matter. In those with type 2 diabetes, higher TMAO is associated with a 3-fold increased risk of a major cardiac event within 3 years and a 3.6-fold increased risk of mortality within 5 years. So this is not something we want to ignore. This is very significant, especially for people with diabetes. So how is TMAO produced? Well, first of all, we need carnitine or choline, which we would generally get from red meat. Certainly eggs, other foods contain choline as well. And then the carnitine or choline, once it gets into the intestinal tract, we have very specific types of gut flora that convert the carnitine or choline into trimethylamine. The trimethylamine then gets shuttled to the liver, where there's an enzyme that converts trimethylamine to trimethylamine N oxide. And we can also get trimethylamine N oxide directly from fish. And then the trimethylamine N oxide, that's the compound that increases plaque formation in the blood vessels, risk of cardiovascular disease, and of kidney disease as well. So now moving along to endotoxins. I talked a little bit about them earlier on, but endotoxins are lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, in the outer cell membranes of gram-negative bacteria. Endotoxins can come from the breakdown breakdown of gut bacteria, or they can come from food bacteria. And they come mainly from meat, poultry, and dairy products, and especially ground meat. Endotoxins may actually translocate from the gut into the circulation, causing metabolic endotoxemia. This is very strongly associated with a low-grade inflammation, insulin resistance, diabetes, and obesity. So just something to be on our radar, and yet another reason not to be consuming animal products. And finally, step 6, eat small to moderate amounts of fat from healthful sources. So very low fat diets that are less than 10% fat, have actually been shown to be effective. Moderate fat diets, 11 to 25% fat, may, however, offer some advantages. So we'll talk about all of that in this segment. If we look at rates of diabetes in plant-based populations, when compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians in the Adventist Health Study 2, the vegans had 62% less diabetes, and the lacto-ovo vegetarians had 38% less diabetes. Calories from fat for the lacto-ovos was 31 to 33%, and for the vegans, 28 to 29%. In the Taiwanese Buddhists, there was 51% lower risk of diabetes among near-vegan men, and 74 to 75% lower among near-vegan women. And in that study, the calories from fat were 22 to 26%. So when we think about the amount of fat in diets used for the treatment of diabetes,
we have some studies using very low-fat vegan diets providing less than 10% of calories from fat. 2 studies from Bernard and Associates compared outcomes of participants consuming a low-fat vegan diet versus those consuming the 2003 American Diabetes Association diet. While both diets were effective in improving glycemic control and reducing blood lipid levels, improvements were greater with the low-fat vegan diet. It's interesting to note that the American Diabetes Association now includes vegan diets among their recommended options.
And we have a number of studies as well that show that moderate fat plant-based diets can also be effective. The first of those was a European study, the Czech Republic, which compared people eating a vegetarian, very near vegan diet, because they only had 1 or less than 1 serving of low-fat yogurt a day. In that diet, it was about 25% of calories from fat. And the vegetarian diet was found to be more effective in improving insulin sensitivity, reducing medications, reducing visceral fat, reducing oxidative stress markers, and reducing LDL cholesterol. There have been other moderate fat plant-based successes as well. The first of those was sort of the classic studies from Anderson between 1976 and 91. And in those diets, he was using between 15 and 30% fat. Danif in the United States, a 2012 study that had just tremendous results, actually even in reversing diabetes in individuals. And the fat, although it was unspecified in this particular study, they did have very generous use of higher fat plant foods like nuts, seeds, and avocados. And then there was a 2016 study out of Korea showing very good results with a 25% fat diet. And then we have a 2015 systematic review of 8 meta-analyses and 5 randomized control trials that were all Mediterranean diet versus control for a minimum of 6 months. And the 2 long-term randomized control trials showed a 49% increased probability of remission from metabolic syndrome with the Mediterranean diet. And 2 meta-analyses demonstrated that a higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet reduced risk of future diabetes by 19 to 23%. And then finally, the Mediterranean diet was associated with better glycemic control than control diets, including a lower fat diet. So I think we got some reasonable evidence that it's possible to include more fat than 10% and still get pretty good results. Of course, the Mediterranean diets weren't completely plant-based, although they were plant-heavy. And then I want to talk a little bit about the low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets, because I think that's very important in this segment, and people need to just be aware These diets are the diets that have taken over. We're seeing tremendous growth in interest on low carbohydrate, high fat diets. It seems to be, as a matter of fact, it was the #1 diet searched on Google in 2018. So it's just very, very popular right now. So just to give you an idea, the percent of calories from macronutrients in these diets tend to be about 65 to 75% from fat. And in the pure keto diet, it can even be higher. Carbohydrates range from about 5 to 25%, 5 in the keto diet or lower, and about 30 in a more paleo style diet. That kind of defines most of the low carbohydrate diets.
To give you a feel for the type of food that is promoted by low carb diets like a keto diet, this is a recipe that's taken from a very popular keto website. It's a cheesy taco casserole recipe. You've got 3 pounds of ground beef, 6 cups of cheese, and 2 cups of frozen peppers. It all amounts to about 54 grams of fat, 27 grams of saturated fat, and 232 milligrams of cholesterol per serving. Not surprisingly, the fiber is less than half a gram per serving. This is actually quite typical of very low carb eating. There was a 2018 systematic review of 33 randomized controlled trials and 3 case control trials that compared low carbohydrate diets, which provided equal to or less than 40% of energy from carbohydrate, with low fat diets providing equal to or less than 30% of energy from fat. The hemoglobin A1C declined more in the low carbohydrate group than in the low fat group. The short-term difference was about minus 1.38%, and after a year the difference dropped to minus 0.36%, and then after 2 years there was no difference at all. The author's conclusion was with low to moderate certainty that dietary carbohydrate restriction to less than 40% yields slightly better metabolic control of uncertain clinical importance than a reduction of fat to less than 30% in people with type 2 diabetes. This study does show that higher fat diets may not always produce negative metabolic consequences compared to lower fat diets. Of course, the diet wasn't really a very low fat diet in this case, and the sources of fat and carbohydrate really could explain the findings here. So I think we need to take that into account.
So a second systematic review and meta-analysis from 2018 with 18 randomized controlled trials compared a low carbohydrate versus usual care diets. The low carb diet arm reduced medications at 1 year. A1C was down 0.28%, HDL cholesterol up 0.06 millimoles per liter or 2.3 milligrams per deciliter, triglycerides down 21.5 milligrams per deciliter, and there were no improvements in weight, total cholesterol, or LDL cholesterol. And their conclusion was that there was some favorable results, but very low carbohydrate, under 50 grams carbohydrate diets were unachievable in the long term, but low carbohydrate diets under 130 grams seemed to be somewhat achievable and useful. So that was the second meta-analysis.
And then there was a systematic review and meta-analysis from 2017 that looked at 9 studies, and low carbohydrate diets were compared to normal or high carbohydrate diets. And in the low carbohydrate group, A1Cs went down 0.44%, triglycerides dropped 29.2 milligrams per deciliter, HDL actually increased 2.7 milligrams per deciliter. However, it's important to note that the low carbohydrate diet did not decrease total or LDL cholesterol or result in long-term weight loss.
I think at this point it sounds so favorable for low carb diets, but we also have a huge amount of evidence for negative effects of a low carb diet. So we want to talk a little bit about sort of risk reward and is it worth it?
So first, let's review some of the known potential benefits. We know that very low carbohydrate diets, especially ketogenic diets, blunt appetite and often result in reduced energy intake. This, of course, also results in weight loss, especially in the short term, although there are less favorable findings in the long term. Very low carb diets also generally improve blood glucose levels. They have a way of flatlining glucose because of the lack of carbohydrates. They tend to decrease triglycerides and increase HDL levels. Finally, participant retention tends to be fairly favorable with these types of diets.
Now, what about the risks? Well, in the short term, we have a number of studies showing increased LDL cholesterol, impaired glucose tolerance. So what I mean here is that even though you get a flatlining of blood glucose, if all of a sudden someone on a ketogenic diet starts to eat carbohydrate, they actually have impaired glucose tolerance, so they don't respond to it very well because we're not reversing insulin resistance at all. We worsen kidney function, we can increase bone loss because ketones are very acidic. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies are very common, and that's one of the reasons ketogenic diets were voted number 40 in the US rankings of diets last year, and that was 40 out of 40, so they came in dead last in terms of health and safety. And they're very low in fiber. They cause constipation. They can cause weakness, fatigue, bad breath, muscle cramps, headaches. And they certainly reduce athletic performance, particularly for endurance sports. And the risks in the long term, well, they increase all-cause mortality. And quite consistently, low carbohydrate diets are associated with higher mortality. As a matter of fact, in one very recent study, it was by far the highest mortality was with the lowest carbohydrate intakes. They increase exposure to persistent organic pollutants that induce metabolic disorders and increase risk of birth defects. They impair artery function, and they increase our risk of cardiovascular disease, which is not a good thing for people with diabetes, as we know. So the whole problem with low carbohydrate diets, and to me it's just as crystal clear as it could possibly be, low carbohydrate diets are high in fat, high in protein, and they're animal-based diets. Just by definition, that means that they are high in all of the pathogenic factors associated with increased disease risk. And they are short on carbohydrate-rich, high-fiber plant foods. Hence, they are low in the most protective fibers that are associated with reduced disease risk and disease reversal. And so we spend a lot of time talking about these things, but just think about it. The components that are most protective are concentrated in plants. By very definition, low carbohydrate diets are diets that are low in plant foods. So you're minimizing, not maximizing, the very components we have to maximize to have an impact. And you're maximizing the factors that are most harmful. And so to me, you can't do that and expect long-term positive results. Any diet that results in a negative calorie balance will result in weight loss and improve lab measures. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthful in the long term. And just think about it. You can think cigarettes work for weight loss. It doesn't make them a good idea. So reversing diabetes requires putting a lid on the drivers of insulin resistance. And this is best accomplished with a whole food plant-based diet that is actually rich in protective factors like fiber, phytochemicals, and antioxidants.
We know that fat has long been viewed negatively in plant-based communities. However, it's very important to recognize that while the emphasis has been squarely placed on the quantity of fat in the diet, the quality of fat can weigh as heavily where health outcomes are concerned. It's the source of the fat that really matters. When fat comes from whole plant foods, health outcomes tend to be favorable, even when there's fairly high fat intake. When fat comes from processed foods and fatty animal products, both providing more of the solid or hard fats, adverse outcomes are often reported even at relatively moderate fat intakes.
So when you look at the actual amount of fat in blue zones, so here's sort of average blue zones, and I think most of you know what the blue zones are, but if you don't, these are places in the world where people live the longest, healthiest lives. It's interesting to look at because what they do is pretty consistent with longevity. They have more centenarians in these places than anywhere else on the planet. They average 25% of calories from fat. You can see the range is just huge, but most of them are in the 20-25% fat range, although one blue zone is down at 6% and another's up at 50%. The thing is all of these blue zones eat fairly unprocessed plant-based diets, and some have a little more fat than others, but on average it's around 25% of calories. The thing we need to realize about fat is they are very concentrated in calories, over double what protein or carbohydrate are. Protein and carbohydrate are about 4 calories per gram, and fat's about 9. And so 1 tablespoon of oil, you're looking at 120 calories and about 14 grams of fat. And if you think about foods that would provide that amount of fat, so the amount of fat in 1 tablespoon or 15 mils of oil would be about 14 grams. So you would get that amount from about 1/4 cup of nuts or seeds, from about 2 tablespoons of nut or seed butter, from 1/2 of an avocado, from about 1/2 cup of shredded coconut, about 20 medium-sized olives, from about 1 cup of tofu, and from about 3 1/4 cups of cooked chickpeas. So just to give you an idea, it's just very concentrated when it comes from pure fat. So when you eat less fat, you can eat more food. So, a tablespoon of butter or 2.5 teaspoons of oil would provide 100 calories. You could get also 100 calories from about 12 cups or 3 liters of dark greens, just a huge volume of food by comparison. So by curtailing our fat intake, we can end up having a greater volume of food to eat. So now I want to talk a little bit about what targets we would have. So when you eat less fat, you can eat more food. So, a tablespoon of butter or 2.5 teaspoons of oil would provide 100 calories. You could get also 100 calories from about 12 cups or 3 liters of dark greens, just a huge volume of food by comparison. So by curtailing our fat intake, we can end up having a greater volume of food to eat. So now I want to talk a little bit about what targets we would have in terms of fat grams on different diets. So this is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And of course, people with diabetes who are trying to lose weight may be on a more like a 1,500 or 1,600 calorie diet. But this is 2,000 calories. And so you can see for people that are consuming 10% of calories from fat, their maximum fat would be 22 grams, maximum saturated fat 5 grams, maximum monounsaturated 5 grams, maximum poly about 10, and they would need about 2.5 grams of omega-3. At 15%, the total fat maximum would be 33 grams. At 20%, it would be 44. At 25, it would be 56. And at 30, it would be 67. So just to give you an idea, for most people with diabetes who were trying to get to lose weight, we're probably not wanting to go much above the 20% of calories from fat. I would say 25 at very most if it's coming from whole food sources. But generally, we're looking at between 15-20% of calories from fat being a reasonable target for these people. So for very low fat eaters, 10 to 15% of calories from fat, and that's in a 2,000 calorie diet, we would be aiming for 1 serving of high fat whole foods per day. And because we've got to get omega-3s, that food would very quickly become flax seeds, chia seeds, or walnuts. So you get a lot of omega-3s in a small amount of food, and that would make sense for these folks. We want to, as I mentioned, ensure it's essential fatty acids. The low fat eaters, which is 15 to 20% of calories, would be 33 to 44 grams of fat in a 2,000 calorie diet. They could aim for 2 servings of high fat whole foods per day. And again, at least one of those 2 servings would need to be omega-3 fatty acids. So they could have chia seeds, flax seeds, or walnuts, plus a little bit of avocado or some almonds or something like that. Then people who are moderate fat eaters, that's 20 to 25% of calories and 44 to 56 grams of fat in a 2,000 calorie diet, could aim for 3 servings of higher fat whole foods per day. And again, at least one source should be the omega-3 source. And then the high fat eaters at 25 to 30% of calories from fat could afford 56 to 67 grams of fat, and they could aim for 4 servings of higher fat whole foods per day. Most people with diabetes, you're not wanting to go to this level. This is more people that maybe are athletes and can't get enough food in a small enough volume, need to have more concentrated calories. So we don't have to worry about that one too much. So what are the most and least healthful sources of fat? Well, high-fat whole plant foods, which are, of course are rich in fiber, antioxidants, phytochemicals, plant sterols and stanols, essential fats, and vitamins and minerals, are the places you want to get your fat. It's the same story as carbohydrates. Carbohydrates come packaged with all of these wonderful things. The same story with fats, the same story with protein. Whatever food you're eating, you want them to come packaged with the things that are going to offer or afford you protection. The least healthful sources are solid fats and damaged fats. So solid fats include hard fats like saturated fats and trans fats in animal products such as meat and dairy, and in hard fats and in processed foods and tropical oils. And damaged fats are those that are oxidized by high temperature cooking. So we'll talk a little bit about those in a bit. So we want to avoid trans fatty acids. The optimal intake is 0. And we talked a little bit earlier about, the big sources now being animal products and a little bit still being present in some processed foods, but animal products are one of our key sources now. But there was a study that showed that after adjustments for confounding variables, people with the highest versus the lowest quintile of trans fatty acid intake had an over 2-fold increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And trans fatty acids were also associated with insulin resistance and less favorable fasting glucose levels. We want to limit saturated fat. There was a 2018 clinical trial that reported that saturated fat, so we want to avoid trans fatty acids. The optimal intake is 0. And we talked a little bit earlier, we want to limit saturated fat. There was a 2018 clinical trial that reported that saturated fat increases intrahepatic triglycerides by about 55% compared to unsaturated fat, which increases intrahepatic triglycerides by about 15%, or carbohydrate by about 33%. And of course, this is when we overconsume foods that we get this happening more. That saturated fat increases lipolysis, unsaturated fat decreases lipolysis, and that saturated fat increases insulin resistance and harmful ceramides, which are compounds, chemicals that are formed largely from visceral fat. And the conclusion is decreased intakes of saturated fat could be beneficial in reducing intrahepatic triglycerides and the associated risk of type 2 diabetes.
How much saturated fat is appropriate for people with type 2 diabetes? According to the American Association 2021 Dietary Guidance to Improve Cardiovascular Health, we should replace saturated fat, which comes mainly from meat, dairy, and tropical oils, with unsaturated fat from non-tropical plant oils. A meta-analysis of high-quality randomized clinical trials concluded that this modification lowers cardiovascular disease risk by about 30%. And that's very similar to the effect of statin drugs. The American Heart Association also recommends aiming for a dietary pattern that achieves no more than 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat for people at risk, which is, of course, everyone with type 2 diabetes. This means an upper limit of 13 grams of saturated fat in a 2,000 calorie diet. It isn't difficult to reach 13 grams of saturated fat if you regularly feature animal products in your meals. One double cheeseburger puts you about 10 grams over your daily limit. A soft taco with beef and cheese or 2 slices of pizza, and you're at your daily limit. You get 5 grams of saturated fat from an ounce of cheese or a cup of whole milk. On the other hand, even high-fat plant foods like avocado, nuts, seeds, and tofu provide little saturated fat, generally with about 1/2 to 2 grams of saturated fat per serving. The exception is coconut, which has about 7 grams of saturated fat in a 1 ounce serving.
And finally, we need to minimize damaged fats. Clinical trials have reported a positive association between oxidized fats, steatohepatitis, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. So what we're talking about here is avoiding fried foods, minimizing or avoiding oils in cooking. If oils are ever used, we should not allow the oils to smoke. Do not burn high-fat foods or allow them to blacken. And this is one that I think a lot of people are totally unfamiliar with. We want to store high-fat foods, including shelled nuts and seeds, in the fridge or freezer. And that is because when you remove the hard outer shell, you expose the fats to oxidation. And so you want to preserve them by keeping them cold. You want to minimize processed foods and also use moist cooking methods like stewing, steaming, sauteing in water or broth, as opposed to dry cooking methods as much as possible. The other big question that comes up is, are oils healthy fat sources? And oils are used a lot in low carbohydrate diets and in Mediterranean diets. And in a lot of the plant-based world, there are a lot of plant-based advocates that are against the use of any oils whatsoever. In my view, there's a little bit of a middle ground. Unsaturated vegetable oils are without question more healthful than solid fats high in saturated fat and trans fatty acids. However, fats and oils contain fewer nutrients per calorie than just about any other food. They have a very low nutrient density. The only exception would be sugar. And when we extract fat from whole foods, we lose most of the protective components in the process. So when we extract olive oil from olives, well, we do lose the fiber and we lose many of the vitamins and minerals. We do retain some of the vitamin E and some of the polyphenolic compounds, but we're losing a lot in that process. And so for disease risk reduction and treatment, it's really best to avoid the use of concentrated fats and oils and to get our fat from whole foods. Now, in my view, fats and oils, especially good quality fresh pressed oils, possibly have more redeeming value than processed sugars because they can help with the absorption of fat-soluble nutrients, not just carotenoids, all fat-soluble nutrients. They can come with a little bit of vitamin E. They have a few things of value, whereas the concentrated sugars pretty much have nothing. So, and to me, concentrated sugars are to the carbohydrate world as concentrated fats are to the fat world. So what about coconut and coconut oil? Well, a systematic review reported that coconut oil raised LDL cholesterol in all 7 trials, significantly in 6 of them. The authors noted that the trials found that coconut oil raised cholesterol about the same as other oils high in saturated fat like butter, beef fat, or palm oil. The American Heart Association says that because coconut oil increases LDL cholesterol, a cause of cardiovascular disease, and has no known offsetting favorable effects, we advise against the use of coconut oil. So finally, we want to look briefly at, do we need fish to get enough omega-3 fatty acids? And the answer is not at all. Omega-3 fatty acids can be obtained from plants. So alpha-linolenic acid can be obtained from seeds like chia, flax, and hemp, nuts like walnuts, and green leafy vegetables. And EPA and DHA, which are the long-chain omega-3s that we need that are more biologically active than alpha-linolenic acid, we can get from cultured microalgae. And this is the same place that fish get their EPA and DHA. They get not cultured microalgae, but microalgae that's naturally present in the ocean. And we can get EPA from some macroalgae. And so those are important sources for some people, and especially people with diabetes, which we'll talk about. So basically, microalgae is the producer of EPA and DHA. And so you can get it by eating fish, but you can also go directly to the source and get it from the microalgae. And it is cultured and widely available for people to purchase.
Why would anyone want to eliminate fish from their diet? Well, fish can be a rich source of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids.
So basically, microalgae is the producer of EPA and DHA. And so you can...
Why would anyone want to eliminate fish from their diet? Well, fish can be a rich source of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, There are many reasons to get omega-3s from plants and microalgae rather than from fish. The first is fish is one of our most concentrated sources of environmental contaminants. It's a key source of heavy metals such as mercury, lead, and cadmium. It's a key source of environmental contaminants such as PCBs, DDT, and dioxins. And it may also contain antibiotics and antiseptics such as malachite green. Environmental contaminants can contribute to beta cell dysfunction, insulin resistance, and the development and progression of diabetes. There are also ecological and ethical concerns associated with commercial fisheries. So it's easy to understand why people may choose not to include fish in their diet.
So how can people who don't eat fish optimize omega-3 fatty acids? Well, first of all, what we need is about 2 to 4 grams a day. And we can get that from walnuts, about an ounce of walnuts, a heaping tablespoon of ground flax seeds, a tablespoon of chia seeds, a tablespoon of hemp seeds would provide 1, so we'd need 2 or 3 of the hemp seeds. And we'd need 20 or 30 cups of leafy greens because it's less than 0.1 in most leafy greens. So we'd essentially need to eat like a horse or a cow to get enough from leafy greens. And where essential fatty acids are concerned, it really is a matter of balance. We need both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, but a lot of people get 10 or 20 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And high omega-6 fatty acids can actually impair or inhibit the conversion of alpha-linolenic acid to EPA and DHA, and possibly by 40 to 50%. So this can be important. It's not so important for people that are consuming direct sources of EPA and DHA, whether that's supplement or fish. They don't have to worry about that so much, but people who aren't, who are relying on conversion, really do have to worry about that balance. But some people do better with direct sources of EPA and DHA, and among those are people with diabetes and metabolic syndrome or hypertension, because they seem to have some difficulty producing sufficient delta-6 desaturase and other desaturase enzymes. And also people with traditionally high fish intake may not convert as efficiently. So how much EPA and DHA? Well, suggested intakes vary according to your EPA-DHA status, but most experts would recommend 200 to 300 milligrams a day. Now, in my experience, some people need significantly more than that to get their essential fatty acid status rebalanced if they've been out of whack for a while. So they may need, 600 to 800 milligrams, but there are a number of supplements now that are completely plant-based that provide that. So it's not too difficult to do. And it's a good idea to get a mix of EPA and DHA.
In summary, we described at least 3 negative health consequences of diets rich in refined carbs.
This